Thank you everyone for attending. This is May Day Afghanistan, building a people's movement to end U.S. imperialism in Afghanistan and around the world. My name is Julie Veragis, and I am the coordinator of the Black Alliance for Peace Solidarity Network, and I have advised BAP since its founding in 2017. From here on out, I will refer to the Black Alliance for Peace as BAP. Some of you may recall BAP organized an International Day of Action on Afghanistan on April 8th. The purpose was to raise the awareness of the public, specifically of the US public, as the deadline for a US troop pullout neared. That deadline, May 1st, has since been bulldozed over as Joe Biden declared that the troop pullout would not happen until September 11th. BAP has issued press releases criticizing this move for a number of reasons, including that the US is now in violation of an international peace agreement in not abiding by the May 1st pullout date. This is especially important because May 1st is International Workers' Day or May Day, and that's why we felt the need to organize this webinar today. And that's why we have a number of stellar speakers on today's panel. We have Ahmed Wali Kakar, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Afghan Eye, that is an independent media outlet. And then we'll have Jacqueline Lukman, independent journalist and radical activist. And then we'll have Vijay Prashad, historian, author, and journalist. But first up, we have Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly. Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly, also known as Dr. CBS, is the 2020-2021 visiting scholar in the Race and Capitalism Project at the University of Chicago and an assistant professor of Africana Studies and Political Science at Carleton College. She is the co-lead of the Black Alliance for Peace Research and Political Education team. Before I pass it on to Dr. Burden-Stelly, you may have noticed we have ASL interpreters. We will have ASL interpretation throughout the webinar. And for the visually impaired, we have agreed to announce ourselves before we speak and when we hand it off to another person. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat box or in the Q&A box so we can answer them later in the program. And now I will hand it over to Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly. Welcome, Charisse.
Hello, I'm Charisse Burden-Stelly. Thank you so much for that introduction, Julie. I'm going to attempt to stay within my 10-minute window. We know that academics can be quite loquacious, annoyingly so. And so I've been asked to speak a bit about the tradition of radical Black peace activism. And so I just want to start with a little story from Twitter. So underneath the tweeting about the May Day event and Black Alliance for Peace's May Day event, somebody responded, "What does Afghanistan have to do with Black people? Why are Black folks always trying to be Captain Planet?" And so I just want to point out that we must pay attention to Afghanistan and the ways war will be sustained, because this has implications for and is linked to the role of the US, NATO, and the core group in Haiti. It's linked to AFRICOM and its role in Somalia and its increasing presence throughout the African continent. It has implications for the United States, quote, pivot to Asia that started under Barack Obama. And it has implications even for the continued arming of police here at home through the 1033 and cognate programs. Not least because what do you think is going to happen with all of this excess military equipment? It's not simply going to go away. And so I just, y'all know I love quotes. I want to start with this quote from Hubert Harrison, who said, quote, "It is hypocritical and absurd to pretend that the capitalist nations can ever intend to abolish wars. For as long as Black men are exploited in Africa, so long must white men cut each other's throats over that exploitation," end quote. And, you know, Hubert Harrison just recently had a birthday. So happy birthday to Hubert Harrison. So the war in Afghanistan has implications not only for Black people, but for all racialized, oppressed, and poor people throughout the world, because it shows inevitably the continued role of imperialism and the ways imperialism is harnessed to the extraction of resources and the placing of profit and accumulation over human life. So, just to define terms, radical Black peace activism is a fundamental feature of the broader Black liberation movement, rooted in the interconnections of the end of global conflict, disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation, racial equality, international cooperation, economic progress, the end of imperialism and colonialism and neocolonialism, as well as the eradication of capitalist exploitation. It constitutes a vision of a new world order in which the United States and the West more broadly are displaced as the world's police, and militarization is no longer a viable mode of global interaction. And it's important to note that the elimination of war is not merely the absence of military conflict. It is indeed and in fact the historical fulfillment of equality, justice, and the end of colonial and racial domination. And so one example of a radical Black peace activist, I think, is Claudia Jones. And she, in the context of the Korean War, analyzed the effects of war on Black women. She argued that this group in particular was essential to the peace movement because imperialism was played out through their bodies and through the bodies of their husbands and sons. Because Black men were subjected to violence in the armed forces that matched the lynch mob against Black civilians and veterans alike. We are still seeing this today. And because war threatened to permanently militarize and conscript Black, racialized, and poor youth. Moreover, the economic hardships produced by the conjoining of warmongering, capitalist exploitation, racism, and profit-driven imperialism fell disproportionately on Black women's shoulders and also the shoulders of other racialized and poor women. Such conjuncture produced labor shortages that drove women off the land in rural areas and subjected them to deteriorating labor conditions. She also argued that in order to ameliorate war, in order to fundamentally challenge war, Black women needed to be organized and unionized, pay needed to be equalized, and special action needed to be taken to protect triply exploited Black women, and to also increase their leadership in the peace movement through the creation of peace committees. So this is important because radical Black peace activists did not only critique warmongering and not only critique militarism as the mode of international interaction, they also came up with solutions, built organizations and institutions, and organized nationally and internationally to challenge these structures of domination. And this is the tradition that the Black Alliance for Peace and the Black Alliance for Peace Solidarity Network has inherited. It's also important to note that radical Black peace activism is part of a broader radical Black struggle for human rights, what we now call people-centered human rights, that emerged out of World War II. And some key tenets of people-centered human rights is internationalism, which means highlighting the racial oppression in the United States and linking it to other forms of oppression throughout the world, as well as highlighting it in international bodies, not least the United Nations and the Organization of American States, in order to build transnational political forms of solidarity and organizational links so that we can challenge not only US imperialism, but the ways in which it is immiserating masses of people broadly. People-centered human rights also is rooted in the idea that the realization of human rights requires a linking up of issues of democracy and social justice to social movements, so that it's not this sort of liberal specification of human rights, but it's rooted in the actual lived realities of oppressed and racialized and poor people. And self-determination is at the center of people-centered human rights. It is also at the center of the challenge to war. So people operating in, in this radical Black peace tradition had myriad forms of analysis. So one was that wars like World War I were often just white fratricidal wars, ways to impose the will of white folks on exploited and colonized and racialized populations so that these countries could enjoy the fruits of their land, labor, and resources, right? And that later on, during the Cold War, hot wars, that is to say proxy wars, were actually waged predominantly in racialized countries. And that as the Cold War shifted into the era of perpetual war that we're currently in, all kinds of modes of warfare with economic and imperial aims have persisted, and I'm sure Vijay Prashad will talk about this, but this includes low intensity wars, sanctions, and forms of warmongering and militarism that aren't just about sort of direct troop occupation. And this is what we need to pay attention to with this so-called drawdown of troops from Afghanistan. We need to be aware that the war will still continue in myriad ways. And so I'll just give one other example. It's interesting because on April 17, 2002, George Bush said that by helping to build an Afghanistan that is free from the evil and is a better place in which to live, we are working in the best traditions of the Marshall Plan, evoking the post-World War II Marshall Plan that ostensibly revived Europe. But interestingly, many Black radicals had a radical critique of the Marshall Plan. So Paul Robeson argued that ordinary people and workers throughout Europe were not a fan of the Marshall Plan because they understood that it was an attempt by Wall Street and big business to take over Europe, right? And that the Marshall Plan was the foundations for the 1949 North Atlantic Treaty that established NATO as a military counterweight against the Soviet Union. And NATO is still playing a role in the perpetuation of wars like the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. Claudia Jones pointed out that the Marshall Plan is actually what financed the French war in Vietnam that the United States later inherited. And so the US mythology that heralds the Marshall Plan as some sort of great humanitarian effort to rebuild the world after World War II was actually a way to facilitate and continue warmongering. And so, you know, while George W. Bush is lauding a Marshall Plan in Afghanistan, with our radical Black peace critique, we can see that that is actually catastrophic and actually just a means of more accumulation and more expropriation and dispossession. Of course, part of the reason of continuing aspects of war in Afghanistan is ostensibly on behalf of the rights of women and minorities that could supposedly be jeopardized after the withdrawal is complete. And Jackie Lukman, the People's Prophetess, will talk more about that narrative. But of course, Black folks have pointed out the hypocrisy of spreading, you know, of ostensibly spreading democracy and human rights abroad when people here are lynched, are subjected to white terrorism. So for example, in 1966, SNCC released a statement in which they opposed the Vietnam War days after one of their members, Samuel Young, a war veteran, was slain in Tuskegee, Alabama, for attempting to use a whites-only restroom. They connected the Black struggle to the struggle in Vietnam and the ways that United States imperialism undermines self-determination and sovereignty, not only in the United States among racialized people, but also abroad. We also need to pay attention to the expense of maintaining the war apparatus in Afghanistan, even as the troops are drawn down. You know, in 1980s, for example, Black people were critiquing the ways that the funding of increased nuclear armament was taking money away from social programs. And so we also need to pay attention to why, for example, there's this huge struggle over getting $1,200 survival checks, but we had a $780 billion quote unquote defense budget. All of this is linked to why it is that we need to pay attention to the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, what's happening in Yemen, what's happening in Syria, and all of these conflicts that are rooted in US and Western imperialism and that affect us all, right? Both here and abroad. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly. So our next speaker will be Ahmed Walid Kakar. And he is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Afghan Eye, an independently operated media platform which aims to provide a counter-narrative to the popular and international coverage on Afghanistan that is rooted in the war on terror. He is also the co-author of the Afghan Eye podcast. Ahmed Walid graduated from Brunel University, London, with a bachelor's in politics and history, and graduated with an MA in World History from King's College London. Welcome, Ahmed Walid.
Thank you very much there, and thank you very much for having me on this great webinar. So my name is Ahmed Walid Kakar, and like I was very kindly introduced by Julie, I'm the founder and editor-in-chief. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of the Afghan Eye. And so today we are talking about the war in Afghanistan, the US war in Afghanistan, the invasion and the occupation. And so I think, first of all, it's necessary to talk about the side against whom the US has been fighting for the last 2 decades, and that is the Taliban. And now the Taliban, of course, have been described in a variety of different ways over the last 2 decades, primarily in conjunction with groups like Al-Qaeda and with Daesh or ISIS. However, the Taliban, as Afghans, we understand differently. They've always existed as a social group and network, specifically in the southern Afghanistan as a religious group and network. And they've always mobilized, most notably against the British Empire in the late 19th century to fight wars. As a political movement, the Taliban were founded in the mid-90s, and they were founded in response to the anarchy and the anarchy and the turmoil that plagued Afghanistan following the withdrawal of Soviet troops and the end of the Soviet occupation. And so this is obviously different to the mainstream narrative. And the mainstream narrative paints the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban as one. And that is not a coincidence. It's because the US-led war on terror and its associated propaganda typifies and essentializes almost all politically conscious people who happen to have Islamic faith that may be construed as being antithetical to Western interests. Those people are all essentially characterized as terrorists. You may hear the word Wahhabi, Salafi, and the label of Al-Qaeda is is a all-encompassing label. However, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda actually have very deep theological and political differences. And whilst the modern West, or indeed many of the members of this panel or people watching this webinar, may not find the Taliban's values to be palatable or to be worthy of respect or admiration, the Taliban themselves don't seek to implement those values outside of the borders of the modern Afghan state. And so we're talking about the Taliban, and it's obviously necessary to talk about the Doha Agreement, which was signed last February in 2020 between the Trump administration and the Taliban. And the Doha Agreement followed what was the Trump administration's initial strategy of what we could say maximum pressure. And in this strategy, the Trump administration sort of rolled back some of the restrictions on the rules of engagement and embarked on a mass campaign of aerial bombardment. In that aerial bombardment, thousands of Afghans died. Indeed, for the first time, according to international observers, more Afghan civilians were killed by the Americans than by the Taliban, which was itself significant. However, this mass aerial bombardment, this mass military campaign, which featured sort of militias that operated independently of the Afghan state, militias that operated directly with the CIA, despite this campaign of maximum pressure, the Taliban were not militarily defeated. And in some cases, they even managed to gain territory. And so the Trump administration, with former President Trump's commitment to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, realized that the military strategy was not working. There was no military solution to the conflict, as Afghans have been crying for the last 2 decades, decided to negotiate with the Taliban directly. And after 18 months, they signed what was the Doha Agreement. Now, in the Doha Agreement, it was stipulated that the US would withdraw on May the 1st in its totality. And that is obviously a deadline that President Biden has now broken. However, the Doha Agreement has obviously come under a lot of criticism, and that criticism, much of which has been leveled at the Taliban. And that was the 2 points of the criticism are firstly, the failure to achieve a reduction in violence, and secondly, the Taliban's perceived closeness to Al-Qaeda. And the criticism is obviously leveled because the text of the agreement itself is vague. There is no sort of clause or empirically verifiable way in which closeness to Al-Qaeda can be mentioned. Indeed, what is mentioned is that the Taliban will not allow Al-Qaeda to attack the US. And according to most observers, as of yet, the US has not once again come under attack from Al-Qaeda. And with regard to a reduction in violence, that was sort of part and parcel reversal of the start of the intra-Afghan negotiations. Those were supposed to start on May the 10th. They were delayed by 6 months because the Afghan government did not comply with the terms of a prisoner exchange that was signed in the Doha Agreement, and the Afghan government objected in principle because it itself was not a party to those talks. Now, those intra-Afghan negotiations started 6 months late with a lot of expectation, a lot of hope, a lot of optimism, but the start of the negotiations were tainted in bad faith that had accumulated because of the reluctance of the Afghan government to comply with the Doha Agreement. And now, not long ago, I believe it was in late January or in early February, what's known as the Afghanistan Study Group issued a report that was supposed to act as a blueprint for advice for the Biden administration. And in this report, what was recommended was that the withdrawal for US troops should not be tied to a specific timeline, rather the conditions, because according to the writers of the report, the Taliban had not met the conditions of the deadline. Now, this essentially, if acted upon, would have ensured the resumption of hostilities between the US and Taliban and thousands of Afghans dying, because the Taliban's primary aim fundamentally for the last 2 decades, it's one of the things they've been the most consistent on, was the total withdrawal of US troops, whereas this report was actually saying what needs to be done is that the Taliban should meet these conditions without actually providing an empirical set of a criterion by which those conditions would be considered to have been met. And now the report also had a flaw in that it encouraged a compromise settlement between the Afghan government and the Taliban, whilst also calling for a democratic Afghan state. But the democracy, or the alleged democracy in Afghanistan, could very well be dismantled by the Taliban in a compromise settlement. And when we look at the people who wrote this report, it's not surprising to find, for example, Mr. Joseph Dunford, who led US operations in Afghanistan for a number of years, and who now sits on the board of directors of Lockheed Martin, which is an arms production company. We find Miss Kelly Ayotte, a one-time senator, who now sits on the board of directors for BAE Systems, another massive arms manufacturer. And we also find people like Stephen Hadley, who was at one point a national security advisor to President George W. Bush, and who is now a massive shareholder in Raytheon, which is also a arms production company. And so President Biden's announcement came at a time when people were sort of hopeful, or some people were hopeful, that the US would continue its military presence in Afghanistan. And the mainstream media, once again, and I'm sure the respected panelists after me will expand on this, was that, you know, women's rights will be rolled back and the rights of minorities, and the Taliban would increase in power, disregarding the fact that women's rights in Afghanistan for the last 2 decades, for the large majority of Afghan women, things have not improved. Their sons continue to die. Their husbands continue to die. They are menaced by what is now a 2-decade-long war. And so the Taliban, I don't think, will attack the withdrawing US forces, despite the fact that the US broke the terms of the agreement. But their participation in future intra-Afghan negotiations is now under doubt, because those intra-Afghan negotiations were conditional on the Doha Agreement, which is now broken. And so we come to the point of how can anti-war organizations in the US and in the wider West grapple with this issue of Afghanistan, or the United States with regard to Afghanistan. And my advice and my issue would be is that for too long, Afghanistan has been sort of treated as an ideological experiment in which people from the outside, through an ideological lens, view developments in Afghanistan and why they are or why they shouldn't be a certain way. And that, I think, needs to stop, because every society moves at its own trajectory. Every society is shaped by its own cultural, religious framework. And so these talks about sort of women's rights and whatever, not only have they been exploited before, for example, during the Soviet occupation, women's rights was also something that was cited, but I think Americans and people in the wider West, as responsible citizens, need to move beyond sort of the sensationalism of the headlines and really grapple with the issue as to why trillions of dollars need to be spent. Thousands of American soldiers need to die. Tens of thousands of Afghans need to die. And at the end, really and truly, for what? And I think I'll leave that's all I have to say. And I forfeit the stage to the next panelist.
Thank you so much, Ahmed Walid. That was awesome, as well as Charisse. And we are going to our next speaker here. Next speaker is Jacqueline Luqman. Jacqueline Luqman is an independent journalist and radical activist in Washington, D.C. She is co-host of the radio show By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, contributes content to the Real News Network, and frequently provides commentary on leftist independent media outlets. Jacqueline and her husband founded Luqman Nation as a platform to express their unique Black radical opinions and perspectives about politics, history, and social issues. Their content can be found on Luqman Nation and Black Power Media, both our YouTube channels. She is also a member of the Black Alliance for Peace and Pan-African Community Action. Welcome, Jacqueline.
Thank you so much, everyone. And as you can see, I am here with my husband, my partner in the struggle, Abdishahid Luqman. If you are a fan of Sun Ra, you'll understand when I call him the living myth. He's here and everywhere and nowhere. Abdus, thanks for helping me out today. So we are going to expand on this discussion of the United States using humanitarian assistance in its imperialist endeavors. So the US has long used the claim that it has a responsibility to protect the dignity, the rights, and humanity of people around the world in countries where it claims vulnerable people's rights are being violated, when the untold backstory usually involves US complicity in creating the very conditions that the government tells us that it needs to swoop in like a real life Captain America to correct. Humanitarian intervention given as a reason for the US to get involved in other countries' affairs has frequently been a clever ideological cover crafted by US imperialists that's really like the 21st century version of the age-old ideology of the white man's burden. The idea that white Western civilization and its accompanying ideals are superior to every other civilization. Therefore, it's the white man's burden to help or to protect others from the alleged forces of violators of human rights or from the opponents of so-called democracy. And with that, we can see that the idea of Western civilization, this term you're hearing more and more, or as Marjorie Taylor Greene and her Republican far-right cohorts wanted to advocate through a new congressional caucus, Anglo-Saxon values, that's really nothing more than a thinly veiled code for white supremacy. But it's been through this idea of humanitarian intervention and the related belief that the US has a responsibility to protect others around the world from oppression and tyranny that's allowed imperialism to win broad support among USians, that's us, even among many on the so-called left, and even among a lot of the working class, poor and oppressed in this country, for everything from direct military interventions and drone warfare to punitive sanctions against whole societies. These actions are framed as the US defending human rights or even as upholding or defending democracy. So the Black Alliance for Peace has consistently attempted to confront this ideological weapon for what it is. And we've sought to shed light on the white supremacist nature of this white man's burden ideology and the murderous consequences in places such as Iraq, Libya, Africa as a whole, and in Latin America and the global South, where NATO has expanded. And of course, in Afghanistan, where the issue of women's rights has long been a tool for the US that they've used to try to justify intervention in the country. So this idea of the Taliban's repression of women in Afghanistan in US propaganda for why it's continued to engage in the country, like I said, isn't new. And defending Afghan women and girls from the sexist oppression of the Taliban, and honestly, by extension, the extreme fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, and some could easily argue from Islam itself in any form. And the idea that freeing those women and girls to live and express themselves in an open and democratic society, that's always the party line from the US state regarding humanitarian intervention in the country. But the claims of the US wanting so badly to help Afghan women and girls are quite honestly dubious. Not because there are not legitimate concerns about the dignity and safety of women in Afghanistan. There actually are. There absolutely are. But the claims are dubious because the US has never cared about the fundamental human rights of women and girls in Libya, in Yemen, in Nigeria, in Somalia, or anywhere that the US has supported or engaged in military actions that have killed and maimed thousands of innocent women and girls and their families, not to mention the lack of concern that the US has for the human rights of Black women and children right in this country, as Black infant mortality and Black women's mortality rates mirror rates found in the global South. And that was before the COVID pandemic that has had a disproportionately negative impact on Black and brown women in the US.
Then, of course, the fact that the Taliban even exists because of the US and its imperialist aggression against the Soviet Union in the 1980s, where the Taliban rose out of the US arming Afghans to fight the Soviets in a war it actually could not win, but the Taliban did. And the people the US used to drive the former Soviet Union out of Afghanistan were left with a bombed out country, lots of US weapons, and not much else. The US wasn't concerned with Afghan women and girls back then. So no, the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan was driven by the geostrategic interests of US imperialism, assisted by its neo-colonial structure, NATO. That is why BAP asserts that it is imperative for there to be international pressure to demand that a real peace process occurs that sees the departure of all US and NATO forces. Let me repeat that. All US and NATO forces, including US mercenaries known as private contractors. Furthermore, it is an arrogant white supremacist position on the part of the Biden administration to arbitrarily violate the February 2020 agreement made between the US government under the Trump and the Taliban by not withdrawing its forces by the original May 1st deadline. The fact that this decision was supported by most of the corporate media and the contradictory decisions made by the Biden administration to send B-52 bombers and possibly more troops to withdraw from Afghanistan reflected the collaborative nature of the press with the interests of the state and US imperialism. In addition to the allegedly 3,500 US troops that remain in the country, of which it was recently revealed in the New York Times that 1,000 of them were recently discovered through an undercount. I don't know how that happens. Private contractors from other countries known as third country nationals, and NATO forces are not counted among those forces and will more likely remain in the country. The Pentagon has assembled 650 troops to send to Afghanistan to provide security for the facilitate the U.S. withdrawal, a deployment the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin approved the deployment in mid-April, and it's just one part of a package of military assets being sent to Afghanistan. There are also the bases around Afghanistan that the U.S. and other countries are negotiating to base troops and material in for the never-ending counterterrorism efforts of the U.S. and its allies.
Wrap, please.
BAP's principles of unity include the right to self-defense, self-determination, and anti-imperialism. It is based on these principles that we call on the U.S. public to demand the U.S. government completely end all involvement in Afghanistan. For decades, the United States has used disingenuous humanitarian interventions and the responsibility to protect as reasons for invading and occupying country after country. BAP demands an end to this policy and an end to all U.S. wars, subversions, and sanctions from Latin America to the borders of Russia to the African continent and the Indo-Pacific region. That particularly draws the connection between May 1st, International Workers' Day, and the troop pullout deadline for that same day. We call on the working masses of the world to rise up to demand true democracy, transparency, and self-determination for the people of Afghanistan.
Thank you so much for your time and your attention and just for being here. And we're going to turn it over to Dr. Vijay Prashad.
Thank you so much, the Lukmans. It's been so great between Charisse Burden-Stelly, Ahmed Walid Kakar, and now the Lukmans tag teaming, which was a great surprise for us. So we see the audience cheering in the comments on Facebook and in the chat box on Zoom, and keep those questions coming because we're going to answer them in a very short while. So now our final speaker is Vijay Prashad. Vijay Prashad is the director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, chief correspondent of Globetrotter, and chief editor of Leftward Books. His most recent book is Washington Bullets, which has a foreword by former Bolivian President Evo Morales Ayma. Welcome, Vijay.
Okay, well, here I am. Thanks for that. This is a really, really important conversation. And I am so happy that I am here with you. I'm more than pleased that we're having this conversation. And the Black Alliance for Peace should be congratulated for bringing this issue forward at the center of, well, the most dangerous country in the world, the greatest terrorist threat of them all, the United States of America's ruling class, a ruling class that has contempt for the world, that despises the world, that understands that the world is there only for its interests and its benefit. That's what we're here to talk about. And I salute the Black Alliance for Peace for holding this event in association with our great heroic day, May Day, the 1st of May, the day of the international working class. About 2 days after the 11th of September, 2001, I wrote an article asking the United States not to go to war against the country of Afghanistan. You know, friends, there is no such thing as an Afghanistan war. I just want to caution you. There is only the United States war on Afghanistan. The Afghans didn't prosecute a war against the United States. Whatever happened on 9/11, it was not conducted by the Afghan people. The United States imposed a war on the 7th of October, 2001. During that period, I covered the war. And in January, I wrote a book, January 2002. This is a very old book called War Against the Planet. The Fifth Afghan War, Imperialism, and Other Assorted Fundamentalisms. You'll never find this book, it's long out of print, but on page 61, I wrote the following. By the way, this was written in December 2001. For Afghanistan, the US war aims are simultaneously as brutal and unfocused as in Iraq, although the interests at stake are quite clear. And what are the interests? There are two interests. At least I argued that there were two interests. The restoration of stability, so-called stability, in the name of capital. So for capitalism, stability is important. And in the interests of US imperialism. And in the interests of US imperialism. All that stuff about democracy, women's rights, etc., we've heard that story before. It's not to be taken seriously. The real issue here was this was an imperialist war for imperialist ends. And that's what I'm going to talk about because, my friends, 20 years later, the United States is going to pretend to withdraw from Afghanistan. And at the same time, it's going to leave Afghanistan in worse shape than it was on the 6th of October, 2001. and it's going to accept the Taliban back in Kabul. What was the point of that war? And is it really over? That's what I'm going to talk about. The first point, on the 14th of April, Mir Rahman Rahmani, the speaker of the Taliban parliament, said that his country is on the verge of entering a civil war. Now, if I could talk to Mr. Mir Rahman Rahmani, I would say to him, brother, Afghanistan has been in a civil war for a long time. It's not like a civil war is going to start. But what he was trying to say is the conflict is going to continue despite this so-called US withdrawal. On the 27th of April, just a few days ago, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, whose claim to fame is he speaks French, that apparently in the United States government is adequate resume for being a high official. Mr. Blinken said Afghanistan is going to enter a civil war. Let me tell you, Anthony, Afghanistan has been in a civil war thanks to the United States from perhaps sometime in December 1978, when Ambassador Adolph Dubs was killed in Kabul. No time to get into that. The US says it's going to remove 2,500 troops, but we know that there are about 1,000 special operatives in Afghanistan. We know that there may be up to 6,000 people operating in Afghanistan, plus 16,000 contractors. Some of these are CIA, some of these are mercenary contractors working for the US government. They'll pull out 2,500 by this hand, and they leave thousands more with this hand. And you're going to congratulate Biden for pulling the troops out of Afghanistan. What are you talking about? Is this really a withdrawal? They take with one hand, they give with the other, whatever that statement is. It's not good for Afghanistan either way, friends. It's not good for Afghanistan. Let me ask you a question. Now, Blinken has said, look, the Afghan Taliban is going to return to Kabul, he said. And he said they'll be less harsh than they used to be, 18th of April. You can look at the record. Mr. Blinken says they'll be less harsh than they used to be. It's quite an interesting framework of assessment. They'll be less harsh than they used to be. You see, what I'm interested in is not the harshness or not of the Taliban. I'm interested in the fact that the United States government has to give certificates for governments around the world. The most dangerous force, which killed perhaps 1 million people in Iraq in an illegal war, which is why I call this the most dangerous country in the world. This country's government is going to give certificates about countries elsewhere in the world. Oh, they are okay, they are better. Litmus test. What gives Mr. Blinken the right to determine what kind of government there is in Afghanistan or in Uzbekistan or in Pakistan or wherever? As it is, the United States has a terrible record of picking who they think should govern. Remember, from Jacob Arbenz in Guatemala, 1954, overthrown. Salvador Allende in Chile, 1973. And then who comes after that? The hideous General Augusto Pinochet. United States giving certificates for good governance around the world, it's a joke. It's a joke. United States government overthrew Manuel Zelaya in Honduras in 2009, and they put a narco trafficker into office, Mr. Hernandez, still sitting there, still sitting in power in Honduras. And the United States is going to give a what? A certificate of good governance. It's ridiculous that people take these gangsters in Washington, D.C. seriously. Think about it. I want you to think about this. I want you to think about this. Who killed Lumumba? Who killed Lumumba? Who killed Lumumba? Patrice Lumumba was not killed by himself. Who killed Thomas Sankara? Thomas Sankara was not killed by himself. These were victims of imperialism. Who killed Chris Hani? Who killed Chokri Belair? And then they give certificates for governments around the world. Who? Who are you to give certificates?
2 minutes.
Who are you to give a certificate about a government elsewhere? And yet they will. They'll go to war to put their people in, and then they will leave saying we've put our people in. Now, why? That's the last few minutes I have. I want to ask why. We know that they are not really leaving Afghanistan. We know that they've been there for decades, not just these 20 years, for decades. We know that they're going to hold hands with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, one of the worst characters in Afghan history. We know they're not going away from Afghanistan. This is an illusion. It's a typical illusion of the US government, withdrawing troops. If they withdrew troops from Iraq, why was there an attack in Erbil, in the airport, in early part of this year in February, for which the Biden administration bombed 2 villages on the Syria-Iraq border? Why? I thought you had withdrawn from Iraq. What are you doing in Erbil? How do you have a base in Erbil? In the middle of the Sahel in Africa, United States is the largest drone base in Agadez. There was a few special forces killed on the Niger-Mali border. The US Armed Services Committee, Senate, the head of the committee says on oath, I didn't know we had troops in Mali. You didn't know you had troops in Mali? I have seen the base in Agadez. It's one of the biggest drone bases in the world. And you say you didn't know there were troops in the Sahel? You said that? Who are you to tell us things when you don't tell us the truth? You will say there are this, that, and the other in Xinjiang because you saw something from Google Earth. I will send you the image from Google Earth of the base in Agadez, Niger. I don't know if there's any congressional authorization for that base. Why? Why is there all this? Why? This is the what and the this, but why? You know, in 2011, Hillary Clinton came to Chennai. Chennai is a city in southern India. She said we're going to build a new Silk Road initiative, which will run from India through Pakistan, through Afghanistan to Central Asia. The reason Clinton said this is she said, we want to peel away the Central Asian countries, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, peel them away from Russia and bring them into United States orbit. And we want to prevent China from building a Belt and Road, or at the time, One Belt, One Road initiative across Asia, through Afghanistan to Iran, Syria, Turkey, into Europe. This move, this building of a US direct line from Central Asia down to India was to break Russia's ties to Central Asia and prevent the Chinese move, commercial move to build the new Silk Road. And they called it, Clinton called it, the new Silk Road Initiative. This is to block China and Russia, to poke China and Russia from Afghanistan, to poke China and Russia from Central Asia, to egg on disaffected Muslims into radicalism. Not only the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, one of the harshest organizations in that area, but to egg on the groups that use the name Turkmenistan. There are a number of them, Eastern Turkmen, Islamic Party, and so on. These are the groups that have been conducting the terror acts inside Xinjiang province in the westernmost part of China. It's in response to that that the Chinese government has a policy of what they call re-education. We can get into that if you'd like. The United States is egging these people on to go out there and conduct terror acts and so on. The Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, which is a multilateral organization of Central Asian states, India, Pakistan, China, etc. The Shanghai Cooperation Agreement said in January they have evidence that more ISIS fighters are coming from Syria into Western Afghanistan. Somebody needs to give an explanation for this. Somebody needs to give an explanation for this. Why has there been an increased presence of ISIS fighters? Why are they being trained on the borderlands of Syria and Iraq and brought into Afghanistan? You see, the point in Afghanistan is not to end the war. That's not what the withdrawal is about. The withdrawal is basically to show that they are doing something, but meanwhile, they are going to continue the destabilization of that area. Because the destabilization of Afghanistan prevents these Chinese and Russian projects from going anywhere. And I'm not saying Chinese and Russian projects should be applauded. I'm saying that it's bad for the Afghan people to pursue this conflict taking place around Afghanistan. The United States is not committed to peace. It is committed to continuing this ridiculous war. Don't fall for what they are saying when they talk about withdrawals. In 2001, it was a bad idea to go to war like this in Afghanistan. 20 years later, they are not really withdrawing. But 20 years later, they are still not committed to peace. You are committed to peace. The Black Alliance for Peace is committed to peace. They are not committed to peace. Don't be hoodwinked by them. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Vijay Prashad. This has been so great, and you really brought it home. So we are going to go into questions now that we've had all of our speakers here giving their great presentations. And what we are going to do is we are going to go to our first question, which is it's from Nathaniel from Facebook. How can we advance these discussions with our neighbors and friends who might feel like the US is doing the right thing, who buy into the propaganda of endless wars? Who would like to take that question? Or would I just, maybe I can just start off with giving it to Charisse first, maybe? Maybe Charisse can answer that first question from Nathaniel from Facebook.
Sure. I think this is why political education is important. And I know we always say read, but you have to read. Listen, we're always pushing political education, reading, and joining an organization. This is the best way to understand what's actually happening in the world, because the mainstream media is a tool of obfuscation. It is not a tool of revealing what's actually happening on the ground and around the world. So which means we have to educate ourselves first before we even have these conversations, because we don't want to be engaging in misinformation. It's difficult. And in the final analysis, one strategy is to try to convince the conservatives or, the white supremacists or whatever. The other strategy is to shore up our forces and to make sure those of us who are committed to anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, anti-neocolonialism, and who are against war, to shore up our own forces and to build up our organizations and our strategies, as opposed to expending valuable energy trying to convince folks who are committed to this project. So that's my perspective.
Thank you very much. One second here. Would anybody else like to take a jab at that question, or we can just move on here? Just one second. We're just having a little bit of an issue here. Just want to get our, okay. So the next question would be from, I'm sorry, just one second, getting a lot of beeps over here. Okay, next question is from Mark from the Zoom chat. I saw many people celebrating Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi standing behind Biden last night, the first two women to do so. The narrative of individual advancement is so strong. And yet, I forget who originally made this point, but it's a more effective apparatus of oppression when it's non-white men doing the oppressing. Are we just blind to this fact? Who would like to take that question? I will maybe pass it on to Jacqueline. Jacqueline, would you like to take that question, please?
Sure, we're having an issue with our video, but you know, okay, here we go. There we are. Hey, we're back. So yeah, the propaganda of the benevolence of the liberal party, the liberal-ish party, and the representation that people like Kamala Harris are used to put in front of us, much like Barack Obama was, where there are just good-looking faces of the same U.S. imperialist policies, are, ideas that really have to be explained and broken down using the policies, connecting the destructive, murderous, imperialist policies that Obama implemented during his administration, particularly in Libya. And also we can look at Kamala Harris's policies as a prosecutor in California, her attacks on working class and poor women, single mothers, and sex workers. So, I mean, these are issues that are endemic to how the imperialist capitalist state works. It continues to oppress marginalized people, but it uses that 20% of folks, that middle class group of people, to say, well, those people and what's done to them it doesn't matter to me. And what's done to people around the world, that doesn't matter to me. But we have to use the education, like Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly said, from these kinds of webinars, from these kinds of forums, and help people connect the dots. And I think one of the simplest ways to do it is to share this information with people. Because there's some people you're not going to convince. There are a whole lot of liberals you're just not going to convince that Kamala Harris is not the second coming of, Black girl magic Jesus. And I think those people we're just going to have to let go. We have to find our comrades among those who will listen and embrace and understand imperialism and become anti-imperialists wherever we find them. And the work it's pretty tireless, but it must be done.
Thank you. So another question here. This is Lopaka from Zoom. How does U.S. violations or alterations of U.S. treaty obligations like the said Doha Peace Agreement impact the full faith and credit of the U.S. abroad? Who would like to take that? Maybe Ahmed Walid?
Well, if he's not around, I could.
He needs to just start.
No, I was just waiting for to be allowed to show. I would say that it does obviously massively negatively impact the US's credibility, not just because this is sort of an agreement that was signed with the signature of the US Foreign Secretary and the President himself, but also because this was done, at a very high profile sort of setting in a hotel in Doha. And it also shows it reflects badly on the fact that with every single change in administration in Washington, D.C., the military-industrial complex manages somehow to influence an outgoing or an incoming administration into pursuing a certain course of action. It really does highlight the fact that the U.S., despite the rhetoric of the rule of law, and the provision of justice, really doesn't apply those precepts of law to itself. If that wasn't clear after the war in Iraq, or the massive violations of human rights and war crimes in Afghanistan, and nothing could highlight it more than going back on an agreement signed in the eyes of the world and breaking the deadline which is stipulated.
Cool. Thank you very much. So the next question is from Alvin from Zoom. Alvin says, is another question to Ahmed. Please address number one, even after 9/11, how about special forces / CIA operations that remain? And two, repositioning of US forces to other Central Asian states. Ahmed Waleed, would you like to take that also?
Yeah, I will. So that is actually a very good question, and something which my friend Imran Firoz has covered extensively as well. He's a freelance journalist. Has been the role of essentially very murky, opaque militias operating in various parts of Afghanistan that are notorious for human rights abuses, and that actually operate independently of the Afghan government, which was installed itself by the USA. These militias operate with the CIA. They operate under CIA jurisdiction or in cooperation with the CIA, who are fully privy to the abuses that take place. Recently, there were reports that children are actively targeted by these militias, and in none of these announcements or these peace agreements are these militias, or the fact that they have a separate chain of command, are they referenced, and neither do we have any clarity as to their future, how they will be reintegrated into Afghan society, if they will be indeed, assuming that they are integrated into Afghan society. And so personally, I don't see a way in which the US would forsake that sort of influence it has on the ground in terms of CIA assets that actively carry out its agenda on behalf of the US as mercenaries.
Thank you, Ahmed Waleed. So the next question is from Zach from Zoom. Zach asks, can anyone on the panel talk about the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan? How, if at all, the party tried to improve the material conditions of the Afghan people, including on the issue of women's rights, and how the US responded? Maybe Vijay can take it?
I'll also answer after Vijay.
Why don't you go ahead, Ahmed?
No, it's fun because I've already sort of spoken already. I feel it's your turn.
No, go ahead. This is not a thing. You go ahead.
No, I'm more sort of concerned that the audience will get bored of my voice. I think a bit of fluctuation will do everyone a bit of good.
Politeness issues, you can't defeat me on politeness. Please go ahead.
So the way in which I would say that the PDPA, I think the question was improve the living standards of Afghanistan. Nationalization, the redistribution of land was obviously a very big part of the PDPA's agenda. However, the PDPA itself suffered from the shortcoming in that it sort of transposed the Western understanding or the Russian understanding of kulak versus peasants. In actually doing so, it actually displaced, killed many sort of tribal village leaders that actually led in the long term to the complete destruction of Afghanistan's infrastructure. In terms of women's rights, there were sort of the cosmetic sort of shows that were made with regard to women's rights, but rape as a weapon of war was used very abundantly by the PDPA, as well as various novel forms of torture. And obviously one of the parallels that has with the present day is obviously the lofty ideals of women's rights, of freedom and whatever were used then as they are used now. So as Afghans, it's actually nothing new that these sorts of ideals are used by one superpower or the other in justifying and perpetuating their occupation of Afghanistan, which invariably leads to more war, more conflict, because a key part of Afghanistan's national identity is basing itself on sort of resistance to foreign occupiers. It was the British in the 19th century, it was the Soviets, now it's the Americans, and we really hope that the world can move on and Afghanistan can be left to sort of work with its own devices on its own terms.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And now, Vijay,
if you don't mind.
Yeah, Vijay, if you'd like to get into that. We have a couple of questions about, people are asking about the Afghan Communist Party, etc. So if you want to get into that.
I actually have a different view of this than Ahmed, and I want to share my view. obviously, Ahmed, you're entitled to your opinion, and that's fair enough. I spent a lot of time interviewing a number of people in the PDPA, including Anahita Ratebzad and others, after they had gone into exile after 9/11. And I think it would be unfair to them to say that they were mainly doing, something from the Soviet Union or whatever. These were genuine Afghan patriots. Anahita Ratebzad and three other women in 1965 were the first four women to be elected to the Afghan parliament. This is, 13 years before the Saur revolution of 1978. They had a serious opinion within the context of Afghanistan's social development of advancing the cause of people against what they considered to be the feudal structures in the country. They attempted to push an agenda. Now, one could criticize the way they did things or whatever you can, but I don't think it's correct to say that they were doing some sort of foreign agenda. They had their own agenda, and it was a pretty powerful agenda. Now, it's very interesting. For about the last 15 years, I've tried to find out who killed the US ambassador in Afghanistan in February of 1979, and that was Ambassador Adolph Dubs. You see, Adolph Dubs was sent there by the United States government. He was a Soviet expert, and he reported that the Afghan government, the People's Democratic Republic, was not a Soviet proxy, and that they were advancing some sort of patriotic agenda. There was no threat that they were going to, invite the Soviet troops in and so on. It's the US government under Jimmy Carter with his assistant Brzezinski that hatched a plot called Operation Cyclone. The evidence for that is at the National Security Archive, where they began to fund people who I considered to be quite marginal at the time, especially Mr. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who I've also had the misfortune of interviewing. Mr. Hekmatyar, when he was a student at Kabul University, had the very bad habit of throwing acid in the faces of girls. Let's all agree that that's certainly not any form of culture, certainly not Afghan culture, which is one of the richest resources of human interaction. And that was eroded by the CIA, by the impact of people like Hekmatyar on the Mujahideen and so on, including Mr. Burudin Rabbani, not the wise old statesman in 1977 and 78. Later, he would sort of position himself as this elder statesman and so on. He was not like that in 77, 78. So I would say that, there were several opportunities in Afghanistan's history. There was an opportunity in the anti-monarchical period. Indeed, there was an opportunity in 1919. Every time Afghanistan has tried to put its own road forward, whether it was 1919, Amanullah Khan and so on, the British invaded, stopped it. After every single attempt, when the Afghans put things forward, some foreign power comes and crushes them. So I wouldn't, like Ahmed, have such a harsh position on the PDPA or people of that kind, the liberals, the communists, and so on. I think they advanced an agenda from within the context of Afghan society. It was cut down. And those people are simply not around now. And that is something that's going to be a problem for Afghanistan, that entire section of the left is no longer available in enough numbers in Afghanistan to provide that form of critique of the society. So, I think that, of course, I believe that all foreign interference should go. I believe Afghans should have the right to determine their destiny. And I hope very much that trade unions will return, that people's organizations will return, and so on.
Thank you so much, Vijay and Ahmed. So there's another question here, interesting, from Matt from Facebook, and it sounds like something that Vijay and even Ahmed could answer. It says, Matt from Facebook says, how does U.S. Afghanistan policy relate to its interests in Pakistan and India?
Sorry, could you just kindly repeat the question just so I could do justice to it?
It's how does U.S. Afghanistan policy relate to its interests in Pakistan and India?
So I think with regard to The US, since Pakistan's creation, has generally been an ally of Pakistan. However, since the war on terror, Pakistan has sort of found itself sliding further and further away from the US. And indeed, part of the reason for that is because the Pakistanis are accused of having ties of varying sort of extents, depending on your perspective, with the Afghan Taliban. And that is because the Pakistanis, to some extent, feel like the Afghan government is too sympathetic toward India. And so the US has, attempted to ignore that, attempted to sort of buy Pakistan and bring it on side and alleviate its concerns. However, that hasn't really worked because the Pakistanis have been extremely reluctant to take full action against the Taliban, which obviously to a large extent base their activities, maybe not so much now, but in the initial stages of their insurgency, they base their activities generally in Pakistan. And so that was obviously something that was done very deliberately by Pakistan in terms of hedging its bets. In the instance that the Afghan government sort of fell or didn't succeed, it would still have its ally, its people on the ground, namely the Taliban, to take over. And in the 2001 invasion, Pakistanis did the exact opposite, where they essentially threw the Taliban under the bus and allied with the US and handed over many leaders, including sort of diplomatic staff, to the Americans to be locked up in Guantanamo Bay. So the regional politics is something that's very complicated, and it's not something that can be sort of addressed in a 2 to 3 minute answer. But the trajectory of Pakistani-Indian relations have very much affected domestic sort of reality and developments in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry about that. So one final question, and that is mainstream Samir from Zoom says, Samir from Zoom says, mainstream large peace organizations have the following types of stances. Do we ignore them or consider them obstacles? For example, we applaud President Biden for having the courage to do what 3 previous administrations could not. We're especially glad that he realizes that withdrawal does not mean disengagement. Who would like to answer that question about, should activists ignore these kinds of, stances, or what to do in terms of building a movement to end U.S. imperialism? How do you, what would any of the panelists recommend, and who'd like to answer that? Maybe Charisse or Jacqueline or Vijay or Ahmed, just let me know. Maybe we can take it from Vijay.
Sure. Well, seems to me it's a good question for people more closely affiliated to Black Alliance for Peace. But just to say a few things, one is that, the world requires a robust anti-war movement in the United States, not an anti-war movement that bows to Democratic Party talking points. You have a 2-party system, which is a 1 party when it comes to imperialism. And you have evidence of this, leaking out of the pores of Washington, D.C., whether it's, the Obama administration's destruction of Libya, the bipartisanship that took the United States into an illegal war against Iraq, the hideous behavior of the United States government from 1804 against Haiti, hideous behavior of every single US government, the Clinton administration orchestrating Bush, Clinton, etc., orchestrating two regime changes against the administrations of Jean-Bertrand Aristide twice. Twice he's thrown out of office. I think he's probably the only person I know in modern world history who's suffered two coups d'etats by the US government. I don't know anybody else who suffered two of them, but Aristide has suffered it twice. This is one foreign policy. There are two parties with one foreign policy, and you need a robust anti-war movement. Well, firstly, in the United States, the world requires a robust left. There isn't a robust left. There is a left that seems to keep going and dancing with the Democrats every time the Democrats invite them to dance. And that habit has to be broken. You've got to build a mass movement that confronts the ruling class in the United States. Without a proper, effective, thoughtful mass movement, can't do it. And I have to say, it's not easy because there is a wretched way in which the battle of ideas favors the worst elements in society. There's a wretched way. This whole American exceptionalism thing, it appeals to people. It appeals to people. Your enemy is not abroad. Your enemy is at home.
Thank you. Thank you, Vijay. And that's going to be it for questions, but we would love for the closing remarks to also address that question, because it is very important in terms of how to build a movement, continue to develop a movement that addresses these questions. So we'll start with Charisse Burden-Stelly. Each person will get 2 minutes to do closing remarks. Thank you. Charisse.
Yeah, so just addressing that question, there is no peace movement that can be appended to the Democratic Party, as Vijay attested. In fact, for example, as Londa Robeson, when she is campaigning for the Progressive Party and Henry Wallace, she points out that the dire need for a third party precisely because war is a bipartisan endeavor. And not only is it bipartisan, it is also supported by all three branches of government. So again, any anti-war or peace movement that is going to be effective and that is not going to reproduce things like the labor aristocracy or American exceptionalism or continued imperialism has to be anti-imperialist. It has to be geared toward self-determination and Black liberation and liberation of all oppressed and working people. It has to be rooted in an actual movement, and it has to be anti-capitalist. I know now we use this tepid term, economic democracy, but it's okay to say socialism. It's even okay to say communism. I know there's some anti-communists in the chat, but nonetheless, like there is part of what, in me sort of staking out the radical Black peace activist tradition, they understand that to have the cessation of war, we have to have a world that in which human flourishing and in which a basic standard of living is at the center, right? So war, again, is not just the absence of conflict, it is the creation of a way of relating to one another and relating to the environment, nations relating to one another, that is about fulfilling the needs and the requirements of all people, not just the ruling class, not just the imperial elite. And so this is what it means to be anti-war. This is what it means to be for peace. And Kamala Harris is not going to get us there. Nancy Pelosi is not going to get us there. Joe Biden, Stacey Abrams, any of these other, people who are embedded in intersectional imperialism and identity reductionism, these are not the people who are dedicated to peace and who are against war, right? All we need to see is Kamala's tour in Central America to see the ways in which she is committed to war and she is committed to the perpetuation of the conditions that promote war under the guise of humanitarian aid. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And we can only take a minute now from the rest of the speakers. So Ahmed Waleed, would you like to give a 1 minute closing remark? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, so I'd just like to finish off saying that any sort of anti-war movement should be based on the fact that I think the people should be very aware of the fact that mainstream media likes to tug at the emotional strings of people in the West. It's not going to tell you that the US military industrial complex is putting hundreds of millions of dollars in the pockets of warlords in Afghanistan that go on to oppress their people and build themselves private fortunes. What it will do, however, is talk about women's rights, education, and whatever, whilst perpetuating the same circumstances that lead to war and terrorism and whatever, all of these other phenomena in the first place. Any we hold politicians to account, but who holds the media to account? And I would encourage everyone, if one truly considers themselves to be a leftist, someone who speaks truth to power, to also manifest as much energy in criticizing and questioning the media and the sources of our information just as much as our politicians, because our politicians wouldn't act the way they did would they not be incentivized to do so by the media.
Thank you, Ahmed Walid. And Vijay Prashad, please. Yeah.
Well, let me go back to my book from 2002 and read out the last paragraph, because I think the last paragraph from 2002 is fitting for what are we in now? 2003, 4, 2021. Good God. Okay, here's the last paragraph. On the continent of sleaze, the military men and the corporate men spill blood to put a recognized government in place that has the confidence of governments, lenders, and our company. Democracy is irrelevant. Distinguished professors and intelligence heads gather to help feed our addiction to oil. As the bombs fall in passive voice, the active voices of corporate greed and military macho have begun to ring. The bombs are not retaliation for 9/11. They are a 911 for the continuation of capitalist imperialism against the active will of most of us on the planet. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And finally, we have Jacqueline and Abdul Shahid Lukman.
So I think the way that we build an anti-war movement is to make connections with people that I always find are really simple. This piece of equipment right here that everybody has, a cell phone, the equipment we're using right now to stream this webinar, all of this material that goes into these pieces of equipment that we rely on so much is the result of imperialism, imperialist aggression, and the support of neo-colonialism and continued exploitation of the countries where these resources reside. We have to connect these issues of not just militarism, not just war in the form of militarism, but also connect the resource extraction, the way the people in Haiti are being repressed and continually repressed after centuries because they had the nerve to defeat imperialism. They're continually punished for that. We have to look at the way Libya and Muammar Gaddafi was punished because he had the nerve to create the most successful African nation on the continent, and had the nerve to want to challenge imperialism even further by creating an independent African nation and bloc similar to what the EU is. We have to connect the policing of people and leftist anti-imperialist movements in countries that are resisting continued imperialism and neo-colonialism to policing on the streets right here in the United States. Not just policing on the streets, but to the school to prison pipeline, to policing in the schools, to mass incarceration. All of that is connected to the resource extraction from countries where people who look very much like you and me is being carried out under the guise of the United States and its allies bringing democracy and humanitarian intervention to all of these other countries. So we have to make connections to the everyday ways, all of the ways that the United States and its allies carry out its imperialist hegemony around the world, connect them to the everyday things that we have in our hands, in our homes. Haiti and the Hanes underwear that so many people wear, that comes from basically slave labor that was enforced in Haiti under the Clinton administration, that has been continued under Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden. We have to make these connections to build an anti-war movement that is not just about not having a hot war, but it is about how U.S. and U.S. imperialism and its allies affects the lives of everyday people around the world, and how they touch the lives of everyday people in this country. I think that is the only way we can do it, and we have to start with the working class and poor in this country. We have got to build this movement from the bottom up. I agree with everyone else who said that there is no anti-war movement coming out of the Democratic Party. We know it's not coming out of the Republican Party. And how do we sustain it? The international solidarity that we build when we're making these connections in the first place.
Thank you so much, the Lukmans. And now we are just going to do a final bit of announcements, such as if you enjoyed this program and if you want to learn more about the Black Alliance for Peace, please sign up for our newsletter at blackallianceforpeace.com at the top of the webpage. Also, you can learn more about the work that we've been doing on Afghanistan at blackallianceforpeace.com/Afghanistan. And if you want to see more programs like this, more webinars, more organizing from the Black Alliance for Peace, please become a monthly sustainer, because the Black Alliance for Peace is a grassroots organization. We do not take money from governments or corporations. Please go to blackallianceforpeace.com/donate and become a monthly sustainer. That's the best way you can help support this growing movement in the United States to end U.S. imperialism. And with that, we are going to say good night. Bye.